100 years ago, almost to the day, the Poplar Council met on the eve of the imprisonment of 30 of their members for contempt of an order of the High Court to levy the surcharges for the London County Council, police and asylum boards. The meeting started late because the councillors were besieged by the media. The business was confined to arrangements to keep the council functioning while the members were in prison. Formal leave of absence was granted to the 30 members. Charles Key was appointed deputy mayor. Committees were reconstituted, so Labour had a majority on each. The borough treasurer was authorised to pay certain bills, and a resolution was passed to fix council employees' wages for 6 months. At the end of the meeting, members stood and sang the red flag.
The people's flag is deepest red, it shrouded off our martyred dead, and ere their limbs grew stiff and cold, their heart's blood died in every fold. Then raised the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds will live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It waved above our infant might, when all ahead seemed dark as night. It witnessed many a deed and vow, we mustn't change its colour now. So raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds will live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. It well recalls the triumphs past, it gives the hope of peace at last. The banner bright, the symbol plain, of human right and human gain. Now raise the scarlet standard high, beneath its folds will live and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here.
Over 6,000 supporters waited outside the town hall for the councillors to address them.
Councillor Sam March said Poplar's action had already had some effect on government, as seen by the promised changes to the Metropolitan Poor Fund.
Councillor Ruggles, all the prisons in the country will not alter our determination to win. Those of us going to prison will at least be better off than some of Poplar's unemployeds, since we will get enough to eat.
Former soldier Chris Williams. I should be a traitor to those left behind on the battlefield if I did not stand against the attempt to overburden soldiers' widows with heavy rates.
Alderman Stewart said, the government is on the horns of a dilemma. I don't mind which one. If it sends us to prison, it won't get any money. And if it doesn't, it will bring the law into contempt.
On Thursday, the 1st of September, the arrest began. The authorities decided the arrest should be conducted with courtesy to avoid accusations of ill treatment. The councillors were anxious to avoid violent resistance because they knew how fights with the police would be used by the media to distort their purpose.
George Cressall was the first to be arrested. Next, Mayor Sam March. After this, the sheriff's men waited half an hour for railway van driver Josiah Russell to wash and finish his tea. Former soldier Chris Williams was attending a meeting of the War Pensions Committee when arrested. The sheriff then picked up Labour of Ben Fleming, who asserted, there can only be one end, a win for Poplar. Then James Jones, who had previously expressed doubts about the council action, said, I am proud to belong to a council which is doing a real Christian action.
The sheriff's men went to arrest John Skerr, but he was out walking. The crowd decided there would be no arrests after dark, so all the councillors' homes were surrounded by supporters. They remained on guard until the arrests were completed. By the time the sheriff's men came next day to arrest John Skerr, there was a hostile crowd which became so threatening he had to address them.
He said, "Don't forget what I told you. No rioting on any account. You have one weapon, passive resistance."
Stevedore Henry Sloman said, "I'm prepared for anything that comes along, as long so we can do the people some good."
Fellow docker Joe O'Callaghan told the crowd outside his house, "We will never give in. If they keep us for 12 months and a day, when that time expires, I am willing to go back for another such term."
Next day, George Lansbury phoned the sheriff to arrange his arrest, along with his son Edgar, David Adams, and Albert Baker. And after speeches and photographs, they were driven off to Brixton. The arrest of the 5 women was announced to the press and fixed for 3 p.m. on Monday at the town hall.
Acting Deputy Mayor Charles Key said, "We have appealed to the people of the borough to allow the official to carry out his duties without hindrance. But this will be possible only with the cooperation of the police. We trust they will appreciate the great resentment felt by our people and refrain from any action likely to intensify the strong feeling that already prevails."
The town hall was crowded with press and supporters, and outside several thousand people had assembled. Minnie Lansbury challenged the critical press coverage of the dispute. Minnie said, "We have taken every ordinary course open to us in the processes of the law, and not a few extraordinary ones. We have employed the most skillful legal aid, and we've appeared in court after court, precisely to have our actions vindicated and to avoid going to jail. The only step we have not taken and will not take is to leave 12,000 unemployed people to starve, for that is the alternative."
Susan Lawrence spoke to supporters inside the hall. A man shouted, "Why let the women go at all?" Susan Lawrence replied, "We are here representing a principle which we have the right to defend, as well as the men. If you prevent us going, you do us the worst turn you can."
Minnie Lansbury brought grim news from Brixton. That morning she visited husband Edgar and her father-in-law George. She said, "George looked ghastly, and he and Councillor Skerr and O'Callaghan had been transferred to the prison infirmary. The food was uneatable, and the only reading matter was the novels of Mrs. Henry Wood, a torture in itself. I have sent a telegram to the Home Secretary protesting about disgraceful treatment of the prisoners."
Minnie was chairman of the War Pensions Committee. Her house had been surrounded by patrols of unemployed ex-servicemen, unwilling to allow her arrest. But after being presented with bouquets, the 5 women were driven at walking pace to Holloway Prison, accompanied by a crowd of 10,000.
Postman Albert Farr and Thomas Goodway were arrested from their homes next day. Goodway's home was surrounded by a 2,000-strong crowd. He said, "Stand firm, no violence, and we will win."
Charles Petherick and Robert Hopwood were also taken to Brixton. Only Charlie Sumner remained at liberty. He was at the Trade Union Congress in Cardiff, where delegates heard him speak about unemployment and the Poplar Council's stand. Delegates gave the council resounding support for their work. When Charlie returned home, he arranged with the sheriff to be arrested.
For all their brave comments reported in the Daily Herald, prison was a great shock to the councillors. The courtesy and consideration shown to them whilst being driven to prison vanished with the clang of the prison gate behind them.
Sam March said on the day of their release, "In spite of the so-called privileges granted us and taken by us, we are of the opinion that prisons are hells. No one is bad enough to be treated as men and women are treated in these modern bastilles, and no man or woman is good enough to be given so much power over the life and liberty of their fellow creatures as is given to the governor and other prison officials.
Brixton Prison, to which the 25 male Poplar councillors were taken, has had as lengthy and checkered a history as almost any prison in the UK. Built in 1821, the prison was first the Surrey House of Correction, and as such was the responsibility of the Surrey magistrates, catering for Surrey offenders, originally with places for some 150 of them. In 1852, the prison was bought by the government to house convicts, that is, prisoners sentenced to transportation. The end of transportation to Van Diemen's Land, Australia, meant that transportees had now to serve their sentences in the UK. So an enlarged Brixton Prison took the overflow of female convicts from Millbank Prison and became the National Penitentiary for Women. It too very quickly became overcrowded and was enlarged to cater for over 800 women. From 1882 to 1898, that is, following the incorporation of all local prisons into the national government-administered prison system in 1876, Brixton became a military prison. And in 1898, it reverted to being a civilian prison, but this time for untried and unconvicted prisoners held on remand. It became, in effect, the local prison for London. This remained Brixton's function in 1921, when George Lansbury and his councillor colleagues were received. The Poplar councillors are today remembered among rather a large number of celebrated or notorious Brixton prisoners over the years: Roger Casement, Bertrand Russell, Oswald Mosley, Brendan Behan, Mick Jagger, the Cray twins among them. None, however, enjoyed the accompaniment of literally thousands of local supporters pouring in protest onto the streets of London, as did George Lansbury and his colleagues. The Poplar councillors were in Brixton for a very short time, but it's worth reflecting a little on the state of our prisons at the time. Two sources are of particular interest. In 1910, at the age of 36, Winston Churchill became Home Secretary, an office he held for only 18 months. Churchill had been a prisoner during his time in South Africa and had a horror of captivity. He had grave doubts about legislation, the Prevention of Crime Act 1908, which had been introduced by his predecessor. The Act had introduced preventive detention, a measure bearing a certain resemblance to 3 strikes and you're out in the USA, and David Blunkett's new Labour provision of indeterminate imprisonment for public protection. Churchill considered unjust the proposition that minor recidivists be subject to prolonged incarceration. He wrote to one of his officials, I quote, "I have serious misgivings lest the institution of preventive detention is penal servitude in all essentials, but it soothes the consciences of judges and the public, and there is a very great danger that the administration of the law should under softer names assume, in fact, a far more severe character." This is the background to Churchill's remarkable and widely quoted speech on penal reform to the House of Commons in 1910. I quote, "The mood and temper of the public in regard to the treatment of crime and criminals is one of the most unfailing tests of the civilization of any country. A calm and dispassionate recognition of the rights of the accused against the state, and even of convicted criminals against the state, a constant heart-searching by all charged with the duty of punishment, a desire and eagerness to rehabilitate in the world of industry all those who have paid their dues in the hard coinage of punishment, tireless efforts towards the discovery of curative and regenerating processes, and an unfaltering faith that there is a treasure, if only you can find it, in the heart of every person. These are the symbols which in the treatment of crime and criminals mark and measure the stored up strength of a nation and are the sign and proof of the living virtue in it." As a result of his approach, the number of petty offenders sent to prison fell dramatically. Offenders sent to prison for fine default, for example, for drunkenness, fell from 62,000 to 1,600 during the following decade. And Churchill personally reduced the sentences of over 400 offenders, particularly juveniles. The number of preventive detention sentences fell from 177 in 1910 to 53 in 1911 and 31 by the early 1920s. In 1922 was published English Prisons Today, edited by Stephen Hobhouse and Fenner Brockway, being the report of the Prison System Inquiry Committee, an independent investigation mounted by Labour Party-related reformist groups. Both Hobhouse and Brockway were pacifists who had opposed conscription and been imprisoned for their pains during the Great War. In the case of Brockway, charged at one point with treason for campaigning against the draft, which he generally resisted. It is striking that at the time of the Poplar protests, the number of offenders in prison was at about its lowest point before and since during the last 2 centuries. In 1920-21, the prison population hovered around 7,000 to 8,000. And this was partly the consequence of a general downward trend in the 19th century, a trend given further momentum by the Churchill reforms, and finally by the impact of the First World War. Preventive detainees, for example, were released by the equivalent of a parole board on condition that they agree to be conscripted, to go almost straight to the front, most of them almost certainly to be killed within weeks or months. The Poplar councillors were in prison for only 6 weeks, which might be read as meaning that they did not experience the real pains of most sentenced prisoners. But that would be a mistake. In 1921, the average prison sentence was only 2.25 months, and those sentences of penal servitude for serious crimes averaged 4.5 years. In 1921, fewer than 500 offenders received such sentences. Prison sentences in 1921, in contrast to today, were overwhelmingly very short. The Poplar councillors were undoubtedly allowed prison privileges in Brixton to match their civic status and political significance, but they nevertheless undoubtedly experienced a real taste of imprisonment. Likewise, the 5 women councillors who were held in Holloway, where they subsequently recorded the conditions they endured.
Nellie Cressall in Holloway said, "The worst thing was the dreadful screaming of the poor young women in the padded cells, young girls taken from a life of freedom and locked up in cells with doors as thick as the doors of a pawnbroker's safe."
At first, the prisoners were locked up in dark, badly ventilated cells. Sanitary arrangements were based on the chamber pot and a daily slopping out routine. Individual visits to the WC being severely limited, the quality of the food caused digestive difficulties for most prisoners.
Even harder to bear was the emotional cruelty exercised by those in charge. A rule of absolute silence, the absence of or severe limitation of reading and writing materials, and the vigilance of the warders, whose promotion seemed to depend on their skill in detecting and reporting violations of the rules. George Lansbury said, "They are set to administer a system that would make a bully and a sneak out of a St. Francis or a Tolstoy."
The councillors were put into the 2nd division and were permitted a few privileges denied to those in the 3rd for ordinary offenders, but the basic routine was the same. All different from political prisoners in the 1st division, who could have books, newspapers, frequent visits, and their own food sent in. They did not have to do prison work and could follow their trade or profession if practical. Both Lansbury and the council's legal advisor, W.H. Thompson, had experienced imprisonment. Lansbury for a speech in support of the suffragettes, and Thompson as a conscientious objector. Lansbury tried to find out during the court proceedings if they would be put in the First Division, but the judge didn't know. Consigned to the Second Division, the councillor's stay in Brixton was characterised by a struggle against the harsh conditions imposed on them. The behaviour of the prison staff in Brixton seemed designed to degrade and humiliate them. Former soldier Chris Williams arrived wearing his war medal ribbons. They were rudely stripped off. I felt that more than anything else, he said later.
Money, pens, pencils and pipes were all taken from them. They could receive and write one letter a week. They were forbidden newspapers. They could have 2 visitors a week who could be interviewed from behind a heavy wire grating for not more than 15 minutes in the presence of a warder. They were locked in their cells from 7 p.m. until 6:40 a.m. For some, worst was the food. Much of it they could not touch, and when they did, it made them ill. The food was brought to the cells in dirty pots and served in tin mugs and plates. The porridge was undercooked oatmeal. The cocoa was described as slimy and bilious. The tea appeared to have been cooked in a cocoa boiler. The meat dinner, so-called pork and beans, consisted of a slice of fat put on a bean mash with dirt in it. The councillors were not alone in being unable to stomach the food. After every meal, a large amount of it was taken from all the cells and sold to pig merchants.
Meanwhile, the councillors continued to manage the business of the borough, meeting at first in Lansbury's cell, but from 17th of September, the council was allowed to use the prison boardroom. Councillor Joe Banks, the Labour Group secretary, kept the minutes. After their release, minutes of the 32 council meetings held in Brixton were printed and incorporated into the formal minutes of the Poplar Borough Council, forming a permanent record of an event unique in local government history. The meetings recorded messages of support from across the nation. There were matters relating to the conditions the prisoners were experiencing, and then the business of the borough, authorising repairs to roads, dealing with rats in one street, opening up additional bathing facilities in another.
After 3 weeks, George Cressall reminded them that Sunday the 25th of September had been set aside to commemorate the life and work of Keir Hardie. The councillors started the day singing the red flag and no master in their cells.
Saith man to man, we've heard and known that we no master need, to live upon this earth our own in fair and manly deed. The grief of slaves long passed away for us hath brought the chain, till now each worker's patient day builds up the house of pain. And we to crouch and quail, ashamed, afraid of strife, and lest our lives untimely fail, embrace the death in life. Nay, cry aloud and have no fear, we few against the world. Awake, arise, the hope we bear against the curses hurled. It grows and grows, are we the same, the feeble band, the few? Or what are these with eyes aflame and hands to deal and do? This is the host that bears the word, no master high or low. A lightning flame, a shearing sword, a storm to overthrow.
In his book, My Father, Edgar Lansbury wrote, "During our imprisonment, the government made unofficial promises to deal with the question of the rates of London if only we would first purge our contempt of court. Father was too wily to be caught in this way. Our prison days were exciting and tedious in turn. We decided to make ourselves as objectionable as possible to those for whom prison discipline was a matter of concern. There was hardly a prison rule we did not break. In the first few days, the warders tried to treat us like ordinary criminals, locking us in our cells and ordering us to march yards apart in the prison yard in single file. They failed. We just strolled about the exercise yards, arguing and causing great disaffection amongst other prisoners. Special food was sent in for us. The town clerk and other council officials, including the medical officer, came every day. Footballs and boots were sent in for the younger ones by supporters. The prison doctor was distracted, especially when Father's health seemed to be breaking down. 2 or 3 of us were genuinely ill, but all reported sick every morning, insisting on thorough examinations in case we had some hidden illness for which we would hold the governor responsible. Warders were transferred and reduced in rank for bullying and threatening prisoners with personal violence. Outside the prison, enormous processions marched with bands and banners around the prison walls. Leather-lunged orators addressed the crowds from the upper windows of houses facing the prison. We could see them plainly over the prison wall, and they could see us between the bars of our cell windows. We sang the red flag, the Internationale, shouted greetings to each other over the wall, and as a rule, Father would wind up the demonstrations with one of his rousing speeches. One of the most important rules is that prisoners must not talk at all or look out of their cell windows. One night, when Father had just finished his speech, a bystander shouted, "What's young Edgar doing with himself all this time?" I had to heave myself up to the window and give verbal proof that I was still alive, if not kicking.
George Lansbury, in his autobiography, My Life, wrote, "On my second night, I was taken ill and rang the bell. A face came to the grating and asked what the hell I was ringing about. I told him, and he went away, and nothing happened. I rang again. The door opened, and the man leaned across me and said he would smash my bloody head in if I did not stop it. I then began to talk loudly. My friends in the cells heard something was wrong and passed the word to the rest of the cells. And then pandemonium broke loose in less time than it takes to tell this story. The chief warder, doctor, and deputy governor appeared to find me in a state of collapse. They were very sorry, and in the end, the warder who was guilty was punished. In all my life, I never met so cruel and brutal a man as he was. After this, everyone with whom we came into contact were more or less civil, though I had a real tussle with the doctor about food. He certified that the tea I complained about was good. I challenged him to drink a little bit of it, but he told me it was not meant for him. I said it was not meant for me either. As a result, we always had fresh tea made for us and our meals specially prepared. The worst thing about Brixton were the young boys we found there dressed in the hideous prison garb, which we never wore, not even the yellow badges with our numbers on. But these boys, in their teens, were enough to make the most hard-hearted of us just weep bitter tears for them.
Stand up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no rights. Let racist ignorance be ended, for respect makes the empires fall. Freedom is privilege extended, unless enjoyed by one and all. So come, ye brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So come, ye comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race. Let no one build walls to divide walls of hatred, nor walls of stone. Come greet the dawn and stand beside us. We'll live together or we'll die alone. In our world poisoned by the exploitation, those who have taken, now they must give. And end the vanity of nations. We've but one earth on which to live. So come, ye brothers and sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song. So come, ye comrades, come rally, for this is the time and place. The international ideal unites the human race.
The prisoners were entertained most evenings by choirs and bands that came not just from all over London, but all over England and Wales.
Down, 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 down. Here's a health to the king and a lasting peace, to faction an end, to wealth increase. Come, let's drink it while we have breath, for there's no drinking after death. And he that will this health deny, down among the dead men, down among the dead men, down, 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 down among the dead men, let him lie. In smiling Bacchus's joys I'll roll, deny no pleasure to my soul. Let Bacchus's health round briskly move, for Bacchus is a friend to love. And he that will this health deny, down among the dead men, down among the dead men, down, 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 down among the dead men, let him lie.
Meanwhile, to a petition demanding the release of the councillors by a group of writers, including H.G. Wells and John Masefield, Home Secretary Edward Short replied, "As I did not order their imprisonment, I cannot order their release. The power to release prisoners rests upon the exercise by His Majesty of the prerogative of mercy. And if the Poplar councillors had been convicted of criminal offences, it would be open to me to recommend the remission or reduction of their sentences. But this is not the position. They have been committed by the High Court for refusing to comply with the court's directions. I have no powers to interfere with the orders made by the court for their detention."
However, on the day this statement was issued, Nellie Cressall, 38 years old and expecting her 6th child, was released. She had had a grueling time in the infirmary. When others were let out for exercise, she was left in her cell. She heard the persistent screaming, and while she was there, a woman in a nearby cell committed suicide. Nellie could not eat the food. Minnie Lansbury, by now in the hospital wing herself, tried to make contact with Nellie by calling her name. Minnie complained about Nellie's treatment, who was soon given hot milk on which she subsisted for several days. Unknown to Nellie, a tremendous outcry was being made on her behalf. Even those who wanted Poplar to fail could see that by imprisoning a woman in late pregnancy, an idiotic blunder had been committed. Once the Home Office realised that her imprisonment was an embarrassment. The official solicitor applied to the court for her release on health grounds. 16 days after she arrived in Holloway, Nellie was told she could go home. However, Nellie refused to go until her fellow prisoners were also released. It took the intervention of Harry Gosling, leader of the Labour group on the London County Council, to persuade her to leave. Nellie said, "The governor read out the order for my release and said he could not keep me for as long as another meal. He had no option but to open the gates and put me in a taxi. I said, 'You mean it's like an eviction?' And he said, 'Yes.' I was not allowed to go back and say goodbye to my comrades, but the matron, the governor, and the wardresses came to say goodbye and wish me luck."
Poplar's critics, among the top trade union officials, had kept quiet, even at the TUC conference, where a composite resolution calling for work schemes for the unemployed included references to the Poplar councillors' stand to call attention to the distressful conditions of the unemployed was carried unanimously.
Harry Gosling, soon to become president of the Transport and General Workers Union, said, "I believe you cannot get anything done until you rebel. Otherwise, they do not believe you are in earnest. In other words, if you want to amend the law, it seems as if you must break it."
The TUC president, E.L. Poulton, observed, "It is remarkable that government and the powers that be attempt, and successfully attempt at times, to take advantage of us trying to act in a constitutional manner, and until something is done outside the ordinary methods, ignore the resolutions we have taken up. Our friends in Poplar have exhausted all legal means at their disposal, and not having been listened to by the government, felt bound to take the action they have."
Jack Jones, MP for West Ham, said, "Where do we find ourselves? The law leaves us in the lurch and tells us that the poor must keep the poor."
Of the 11 London boroughs controlled by Labour, 2, Stepney and Bethnal Green, voted to take the same action as Poplar and not collect the precepts for the LCC. 2 others, Shoreditch and Battersea, the vote to follow Poplar was lost by a single vote.
For all the support the Poplar councillors had engendered, Poplarism, a prerogative phrase coined by the Daily Mail, shorthand for use of public money to spend on extravagant welfare provisions, had its opponents. There was the Lloyd George coalition government, a hostile press, the Poplar Borough Municipal Alliance, and the London County Council. And they came into direct conflict with the leadership of the Labour Party. Ramsay MacDonald, a moderate, would have no truck with the unconstitutional methods being employed by a Labour local authority. J.H. Thomas, MP for Derby and a trade union leader, asserted that the illegal Poplar Rates Rebellion could seriously undermine Labour prospects as a party of government.
And they came into direct conflict with the Mayor of neighbouring Hackney and Secretary of the London Labour Party, Herbert Morrison. Here was a man determined to show that Labour was fit to govern, committed to effecting change through constitutional means. He looked on in disdain at the public spectacle that was taking place in Poplar. Such action threatened the electoral machine that Morrison was building. He feared that the direct defiance of the law opened up the possibility of central government appointing commissioners to run the council.
Susan Lawrence suggested that Harry Gosling be invited to join one of the council meetings in Brixton. He was an East Ender and a member of the Parliamentary Committee of the Trades Union Congress.
Gosling told the councillors the LCC Labour group was meeting shortly. He wondered if the group should convene the LCC to consider the question of Poplar and imprisoned councillors. He congratulated the councillors on their stand and asked for suggestions. Albert Baker said, The councillors have made up their mind there could be no discussion on the question of compromise whilst they were in prison. Nothing would be discussed until they were together outside.
Gosling said he was not seeking a compromise. Lansbury stressed the priority was to see what could be done to get them out. They were deadlocked. They were in prison and the LCC was not getting their money. The LCC's position was futile. Gosling said they could rely on him to do everything possible to secure their release.
The councillors found Herbert Morrison to be their most formidable opponent. All along, they had been obliged to answer his political objections to their stand, but now they had to ward off his attempts to involve them in negotiation while still in jail, to act as mediator and, in effect, take the conduct of their campaign out of their hands. The publicity they were receiving was enormous. Many organisations were passing resolutions in support of the Poplar action. There were marches all over the country by the unemployed, demanding work or maintenance. Deputations to guardians and other councils were shaping up to follow Poplar's lead.
To rescue the situation, Morrison led a deputation of London Labour mayors to meet Prime Minister Lloyd George, who had toothache and was resting in the Highland village of gaoled. The Poplar acting mayor was not invited, but attempts were made to persuade Morrison to demand the release of the councillors, but he declined, not wanting the Poplar affair to cloud the issue. Morrison had to do something to prove that constitutional methods of campaigning could succeed where direct action could not. It was crucial to him that his deputation would win concessions and that relief would be forthcoming for the poorer Labour boroughs.
The Prime Minister brushed aside Morrison's proposals for government to invest in major public works programmes. He also rejected any further equalisation of the rates, which he said would only arouse opposition from most of the London boroughs. Morrison and the deputation returned to London empty-handed.
At one of their meetings, the councillors decided to write to all Poplar school children to explain what they were doing. Here is part of the letter. Brixton Prison, September 25th, 1921. My dear boys and girls, we have received your kind and most welcome letters, and thank you all for thinking of us. We are all as pleased with your remembrance as with the remembrance of our best friends. We are very glad you all understand why we are here. We have not done anything we are ashamed of. Our action was against bad laws, and all good men and women should protest and refuse to obey laws which are unjust. John Hampden, who your teachers have told you about, refused to pay unjust taxes and commenced a revolution which took off the head of King Charles. George Washington and his friends would not pay taxes, which they considered wrong, and this resulted in the establishment of the Great Republic in America. We are in prison because our people in Poplar are poor and cannot pay the rates and taxes, and we shall not do what the judges said we must until Poplar gets help to help the poor. We want you to grow up strong, active, loving men and women. We want you never to be content while there is a single man or woman starving. It is the selfishness and greed of people that makes poverty. We hope all you boys and girls will live to see the day when there will be no poor paupers and no millionaires, because you and your fellow men and women will join together to work for all. Here's our love and lots of good wishes from yours truly, S. March, Mayor of Poplar, and the councillors in prison.
Throughout this time, the Poplar Council generated much coverage in the national press. In effect, Lansbury continued to exercise editorial control over the Daily Herald, and with a stream of visitors to the councillors, both in Brixton and Holloway, it was not difficult to garner stories for the press and feed the movements to get the councillors released and to reform support for the unemployed. Negotiations between Minister of Health, Sir Alfred Mond, the London Labour mayors, Harry Gosling, leader of the Labour group on the LCC, continued, but every suggestion for a conference was thwarted by the Poplar councillors standing firm on their resolution. Release first, negotiations afterwards.
There appeared no means of releasing the councillors unless they purged their contempt by levying the charges for LCC, police and asylum boards. The councillors were determined not to give in. Expert legal opinion in the Times confirmed the impasse and asserted that the conflict would go on for a long time. However, a letter from a KC in the Times pointed out there was another way of gaining the council's release, namely that if the LCC and the Asylum Board affirmed they no longer wanted the councillors to be imprisoned, and the councillors apologised to the court, then the court could order their release. W.H. Thompson, lawyer for the council, adopted this approach. The Asylum Board took the view that the time for coercion was over, the time for conciliation is come. The mood of the LCC was less accommodating. After much manoeuvring, they came up with a resolution that was carried unanimously. That this council would welcome a conference between the Ministry of Health and the Poplar Borough Council, with the objective of overcoming the existing difficulties, and would further welcome any action by the Poplar Borough Council which would enable them to freely participate in such a conference.
It was not easy to draw up an affidavit which could satisfy the High Court and preserve the Council's principles. W.H. Thompson came up with the following. We desire to express our profound regret that our action has involved us in disobedience to the order of the court, and to further disclaim any wish to treat the court otherwise than with the respect due to it. We are very sensible of the consideration already shown to us, both by this honourable court and by the Court of Appeal, and we are anxious to disavow any intention whatsoever of contumacy. We are informed and believe that a conference for all the interested parties is being called by the Minister of Health to consider the admitted difficulties of the present financial situation with a view to arriving at a satisfactory solution to them. We earnestly desire to be present at this conference and to assist to the very best of our ability in putting an end to the unhappy position in which our constituents are placed through economic causes beyond their control. We are hopeful that such a conference will have a successful issue, and no efforts of ours will be spared towards that end. We therefore most earnestly ask that this honourable court will be pleased to release us from our present imprisonment and to grant us an indulgence, which we desire emphatically to ensure the court will neither be misplaced or abused.
The Lord Chief Justice said the court had considerable difficulty in dealing with the matter because nothing had been said in the affidavits about carrying out the order of the court. The judge went on. The LCC says it will welcome any action on the part of the Borough Council, which would enable them to freely take part in the conference. He described the sentence as ingeniously framed, and the court thought it might be treated as consent on the part of the prosecutors to their discharge. In these circumstances, and having regard to the changes in Poplar set out in the second affidavit, unemployment had grown to 15,000, we have come to the conclusion that we can discharge the prisoners from custody. W.H. Thompson, Charles Key, and Harry Gosling drove to Holloway Prison. They picked up the women who were presented with bouquets and drove to Brixton, where at 6 the 25 men stepped through the prison gate laughing and singing. Back in Poplar, The Irish band marched them home. The crowds cheered.
It took months to find acceptable resolutions to all the issues the London Labour councillors wanted. An increase in the Metropolitan Common Poor Fund capitation grant from 5 pence to 1 shilling and 8 pence. The whole costs of unemployment to be transferred to the government. If this was not acceptable, then the Guardian's expenditure on outdoor relief to be pooled and equalised across London. That the equalisation rate be raised from 6 pence to 2 shillings in the pound. The wealthy boroughs of City of London, Westminster, Hampstead, Kensington and Chelsea resisted any meaningful equalisation of the rates and threatened to oppose any charges. The Westminster Town Clerk, John Hunt, knew something had to be done to ward off unrest amongst the unemployed. He proposed that the poor law expenditure in London should be pooled and relief given out to those in need on scales laid down by the Minister of Health. Poplar did well out of the arrangement, gaining an additional 350,000 in the first year and 500,000 in subsequent years. Bermondsey, Shoreditch, Southwark and Camberwell did much better than under the equalisation proposals.
The arguments rumbled on and focused then as now on attitudes towards the poor and unemployed. Strivers versus skivers. Reasonable levels of relief or benefits for the unemployed were said to discourage people from finding employment. Another story. The councillors incurred huge surcharges for being overgenerous in their payments to workers and poor relief claimants. 2 health secretaries, John Wheatley Labour and Neville Chamberlain Conservative, did the councillors great service by writing off their debts that ran into thousands of pounds and wiped their slates clean.
The Poplar councillors exposed the appalling conditions of our prisons. What has changed? Professor Morgan.
The accounts of the popular councillors, together with that of the suffragists and pacifists during the First World War, systematically exposed the conditions in which prisoners were held. Their sacrifices exposed an aspect of the modern state too often neglected. But what of today? How do we treat those of our fellow citizens who fall foul of the law? First, though political argument does result in some protesters being imprisoned, such events are today very rare. The overwhelming majority of prisoners today, as in 1921, are recruited from the ranks of the multiply disadvantaged. Illiteracy, innumeracy, experience of child abuse, poverty, poor mental health, drug dependency. These are the characteristics that are grossly overrepresented amongst the prison population. Holloway Prison has long gone, but HMP Brixton is still there. The buildings are much as they were in the mid-19th century. Today, the prison service provides roughly the same certified accommodation at Brixton, between 500 and 600 places, for which it was originally built. But how many prisoners does it routinely accommodate? Between 700 and 800, 738 at the time of the most recent inspection, which is to say that over 60% of the cells at Brixton, cells designed almost 170 years ago for single occupancy, are today overcrowded with 2 prisoners. Today, HMP Brixton is a Category C low security prison for sentenced prisoners. It's what the prison service terms, without apparent irony, a resettlement prison. That is, a prison from which most prisoners can anticipate that they will be released. But note, the inspector report that no accredited offending behaviour programmes are offered at Brixton prisoners, and a high proportion are released without adequate accommodation or employment arrangements having been prepared for them. A whole wing at Brixton now houses sex offenders, approximately 200 of them. Over 60% of the Brixton population are either black or brown. Brixton is not as acutely overcrowded today as it was in 1990, when the prison was inspected by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. In 1990, the prison was housing 1,005 prisoners, which is to say that it was almost 100% overcrowded. The inspectors concluded that the cumulative impact of overcrowding, lack of integral cell sanitation. In 1990, all Brixton prisoners were having to slop out, or if caught short, as the saying goes, forced to throw their feces wrapped in newspaper parcels out of their cell windows. And they were confined to those cells for 23 or more hours a day. This amounted, the European inspectors concluded, to inhuman and degrading treatment. That is, treatment contrary to Article 3 of the European Convention for the Protection of Fundamental Human Rights. The committee found the same conditions at Wandsworth and Leeds prisons. Today, slopping out has gone. The prison service has restored the cell lavatories for which the prison was provided when it was first built. But during the last year, as a result of COVID, prisoners at Brixton, as elsewhere, have been almost entirely confined to their overcrowded cells, and they disallowed visits, inhuman and degrading conditions, I would argue, by default. Brixton is less overcrowded today because governments of left and right, New Labour, Coalition and Conservative, have fed their addiction for longer and longer sentences by building more and more prisons. They've engaged in precisely the sort of bidding war that Winston Churchill implicitly feared as to who could out-tough each other. At just under 80,000, the prison population of today is 10 times what it was in 1921 and double what it was in 1990. In 1921, there was still the death penalty and flogging remained a prison punishment, but it was rarely done and sentences of more than 10 years were virtually unheard of. Today, they're almost commonplace. There are today more than 8,500 prisoners serving life sentences, more than in France, Germany, and Italy combined, with 75 of them subject to what are termed whole life sentences without hope of parole, another provision which the European Court has condemned. Life does not generally mean life, but it does mean longer and longer. Our addiction to imprisonment is profoundly counterproductive, not least because it continues at the same time as we've allowed to run down the community services that might tackle the ills from which those offenders repeatedly facing imprisonment typically suffer. Our youth services have been substantially dismantled. Our mental health services are quite inadequate. We have fetishes about drug use, which makes community-based treatment programs next to impossible to deliver. And catastrophically, we have dismantled and disheartened our probation services, even if now there are plans to try and put Humpty Dumpty back together again. All of which is to say that we are in many respects less progressive today than we were when George Lansbury and his Poplar colleagues were imprisoned in 1921. There is very little in our record that we can turn to with pride. We need desperately to hearken the message embodied in George Lansbury's famous hymn.
Finally, we leave you with George Lansbury's favourite hymn.
And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our cloud? satanic mills. Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep